Hello there. My name is Nate Seaskin, and I am a program associate here at the Shared Use Mobility Center. I am based in Chicago. And for those who would like a physical description, I am wearing brown/black rimmed glasses. I am white with brown hair, and I am currently wearing a red button-up shirt. Today, we are hosting a discussion titled Innovators, Agitators, and Activists. And we have three great panelists. We have Christina Whitehouse from Bike Lane Uprising in Chicago, Tony Jordan from the Parking Reform Network in Portland, Oregon, and he's based in Portland, Oregon, and Maddie Ruvolo, who is a transportation planner at the Accessible Services Division at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. So I will let each of the panelists introduce themselves first. I will go to Christina, and I want to learn from you what is Bike Lane Uprising, and why do bicyclists report bike lane obstructions to Bike Lane Uprising?
Well, thank you for having me. For a physical description, I am a female, long hair, glasses. I'm wearing a Bike Lane Uprising t-shirt that is green, as well as jorts. So thank you very much. Bike Lane Uprising is a civic tech platform. It's used for documenting bike lane obstructions. We take those bike lane obstructions that have been crowdsourced from cyclists all over North America, and we map them out. We do data analysis, and we use those to prevent future obstructions and, hold the people that are doing this on purpose, accountable for what's taking place. Cyclists report to our database because, frankly, there just really aren't a lot of other opportunities. While cities do have, options like maybe 311 or calling the police or something like that, a lot of cyclists have preferred to submit to our database because, one, they know that we're listening. A lot of people submit to, their city's services, and our database has actually proven that, like the 311 system in Chicago, those reports actually kind of fall on deaf ears. So people feel that, they're reporting to people like themselves, that we do take those obstructions very seriously. And we do it in a very user-centered approach. So we're, kind of building products that are very much for them versus like, the back-end agencies.
Thank you. Now, well, Tony, would you like to introduce yourself, describe the Parking Reform Network, and how can insiders and outsiders work better together to get the best outcomes?
Hello, I'm Tony Jordan. For a visual description, I am a white male with short brown hair and a short beard. I'm wearing a blue Hawaiian kind of print shirt with a collar. Parking Reform Network is a organization I co-founded a few years ago with the goal to kind of help educate the public about parking policy and its impacts on climate change, housing, transportation, equity, and to try and create a place where reformers and activists from various areas can kind of deal with parking policy, which is, I think, a foundational issue to making progress on some of these policy areas. One of the things inherent in the name and network is to try and connect, I think, like staffers. So in your question, insiders, outsiders, I think of often like in my role as a committee member over the years, you have outside activists who are asking for, whether it be on housing or transportation, asking for a lot and trying to convince the staff or the elected officials or whoever it is that's making the policy decision to come up with a bold proposal that you can support. And I often notice that there's somewhat of a disconnect of at least in my city, of the staff or sometimes the consultants aiming low, not being afraid that the council won't support something if it's too progressive or perceived as radical. And on the outside, when a proposal comes forward that then is maybe too aiming towards the middle, it can't generate the excitement from the the activists or the organizers in the community to really generate support for it. So I think that trying to connect it, one thing I try and do with our organization is provide a way for the professional staff and activists to have some sort of communication so that you can know, the staff can know that there's a support for them and hopefully aim a little higher in the proposals they bring to the public.
Thank you. Maddie, would you like to introduce yourself and answer why, how can shared mobility activists build bridges with and better engage the disability community?
Sure, thanks, Nate. My name is Maddie Ruvolo. I use she, her pronouns. For a physical description, I'm a white woman with shoulder length brown hair and I'm wearing a gray sweater. I am a disabled transportation planner. I came to transportation planning originally after working in disability rights. And so I was really excited about bringing a disability rights lens into the transportation planning world. I had worked a little bit on transportation issues when I was at a disability rights organization, but really when I first came to SFMTA, I realized how transportation planning was also a really useful lens for thinking about disability issues. And so I think I see my role, I'm not in an activist role anymore, but I try to work as sort of a bridge builder between staff at the agency, which I am one, and then also working with community-based organizations that I built relationships with over the years and understand perspectives more because I have that lived experience as a disabled person. And I think disabled people and shared mobility activists should be natural allies in a lot of ways. You know, disabled people are far more likely not to drive, are far more likely to be low income, need to ride transit, need to avail themselves of shared mobility options. And yet I think in a lot of ways, disabled people are used as sort of a political football in transportation planning conversations where, you know, when a disabled person does mention that they may need to drive somewhere or that they do need a car, the automatic response, I think, from a lot of folks in the transportation community is to sort of shut down and not want to think about that and to sort of dismiss the person as reactionary or as just being sort of in the, you know, same sort of car-centric mode. And, you know, obviously disabled people, like all people, are in our car culture. And so, you know, there is, of course, some of that that is seeped into all of our mindsets, but I think really understanding better what disabled people need, listening to disabled people, and being honest about areas where needs do align and also where needs might not align. Like there are, I think, many ways in which disabled pedestrians and cyclists, whether disabled or not, share a lot in common and share needs and should be working together. And I think there are also areas where there are sometimes conflicting access needs. And so we need to really work together and build relationships and build trust so people can be honest with each other and work together to build a broader coalition.
Hey, Maddie, this is Christina. I'd love to hear more on that, especially, you know, it's something that we feel very strongly about at Bike Lane Uprising. I know a lot of bike lanes, while they often are seen as just for cyclists, they're actually used by, you know, people on scooters, people on skateboards, and also people in wheelchairs, you know, prefer to use them because it's easier than going up a sidewalk ingress and then down the egress of a sidewalk. You know, what can we do like within the biking community and, you know, people from your communities to kind of help advocate for one another?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There are great points. I think also, of course, there are many disabled cyclists. There are some folks with disabilities who find it easier to cycle than to walk, for example. And so there are, of course, disabled people who need to use the bike lane to cycle as well, whether that's on a conventional two-wheel bicycle or on a hand cycle or another adaptive device. But I have seen a lot of, I think, mistrust from folks in the disability community because they have felt so ignored and because they have felt like their needs have been dismissed. And I think, I mean, there, there's this broader context here of, so yesterday was the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? That's a long time. And yet so many of our transportation systems are still inaccessible. And so I think a lot of disabled people, when they're thinking about transportation, they're really trying to just get access to a lot of really basic mobility options that I think a lot of able-bodied people take for granted. And so I think cyclists need to come into that conversation aware of this broader context, aware that disabled people are used to not being listened to or not really getting anywhere with active transportation advocates. And I think also probably putting aside, I think I see this on Twitter, like whenever there's an argument about like whether disabled people need cars or like what, like just like a lot of the rhetoric around cars. And I feel like, we should be going after like the wealthy able-bodied people who take the vast majority of single occupancy vehicle trips, but like really seeking to like listen and understand to disabled people when they're honest about their transportation needs. And I think building trust and building relationships will really enable the communities to find that common ground. And I think also might allow more disabled people to see that like cycling could be an option for them, or to see cycling activists as their allies against cars. I mean, like we know disabled people are also more likely to be injured and killed in vehicle collisions. But I think a lot of disabled folks are not necessarily thinking about transportation issues in those terms right now, because a lot of disability organizations feel like they have so many other priorities that thinking about like working on bike lanes maybe seems like small potatoes, even though we know it isn't, because we know transportation safety is so crucial for everybody and is especially crucial for vulnerable road users like disabled folks. So yeah, I mean, I guess like it's a basic answer to say like build trust and build relationships, but I do think there has been sort of this like breakdown where these needs, like disabled people and cyclists, are pitted against each other, and that isn't how it should be at all. And we should unite against some common enemies of, like our rampant car culture that makes it really hard to get around if you can't drive.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Maddie, Tony, I wonder if you would entertain a follow-up question to this too, because I think it ties, like when you mentioned the ADA anniversary, and we've continued to build over the last multiple decades, like in a very car-centric way. And a lot of my work is trying to get less parking built, and I get pushback often on that, like that it's not, maybe it's not entirely accessible. So I'm wondering, like, how critical is new automobile infrastructure to provide equitable access? Like, given the external impacts of driving, which you mentioned many of, like, what is kind of like the minimum car subsidy or car infrastructure we can expect to build while still serving the needs of people with disabilities?
Yeah, that is a great and very challenging question, because of course, right, I mean, I also feel like we should not, like, we need to dismantle so much of our car infrastructure, but I also don't think it's fair to ask disabled people to be, like, I feel like so often disabled people are the ones who are asked to compromise, right? Like, this project is being put together and like, oh, like disabled people are often the like political losers in a lot of these conversations around transportation. And so I think people are really wary and are not trusting that we can necessarily build something better. And so I think what we need to do is we need to show people that we can build a better, more accessible transportation system. Like, I would love to see, folks in the cycling and the parking reform world, like really come out strong on, like, for example, fixing sidewalks and making sure elevators and transit stations are not, always broken. Like, I think there are so many basic accessibility issues. And if we saw like more support on those issues that really matter and make a difference for disabled folks getting around in their day-to-day life, I think more disabled people would entertain the idea of, okay, like maybe we can build something better. Like, I think right now a lot of folks are just sort of seeing the downsides for them personally. And, we also need to make it possible for people to experience the upsides of, like, well, what do we get when we don't build as much car infrastructure? Like, when we build less parking, like, can we build in some wins for the community? I mean, like, for example, you know, like, can we use like parking meter revenue to pay for sidewalk improvements? I think like that kind of thing where we can make direct ties makes it a lot more palatable to say like, actually, we are going to make this change. And even though it might feel uncomfortable at first, like ultimately it will be better. But I'm curious for both of you, if you have had experience, and I guess maybe I'll direct discussion at Christina first. I kind of want to turn the question you asked to me back at you and ask you from your perspective as a cycling activist, like how have you worked to build bridges, both with the disability community, but also with other marginalized communities who might be kind of wary of the like, what maybe the stereotypes around like shared mobility activists?
So I think that there's a lot of just misconceptions of like the benefits of a bike lane just in general, because of one, just the name, like it just says bike lane. It's not micromobility. Micromobility doesn't really roll off of the tongue. So it, you know, it started out as bike lane and it just has kind of stayed that way. But we know it's being used by all of these other types of people, and not just that, but all of these other types of people that, you know, are using this bike lane. They're, you know, they're getting people off of the sidewalks, and they're getting a lot of some of like the sidewalk clutter off of the sidewalk. So, I mean, just that in itself for the people that, you know, need to use the sidewalks, that's, you know, better for people that need to use the sidewalks too. But I think just the, you know, kind of as I mentioned before, there's just this misconception that, oh, you know, bike lanes are bad for, you know, people with, you know, disabilities. And, you know, as you mentioned, you can get further on a bike if you have like, you know, a pain or something like that, and it's difficult to walk, you can get further, so much further than what people, you know, expect. And, you know, a lot of people rely on it that, you know, are kind of overlooked, as you've mentioned. And I think one, to just kind of offer that visibility, there's a lot of stereotypes within biking, that there's only one type of cyclist, and that cyclist wears all Lycra and they, you know, only, you know, bike really fast, and it's just for, you know, recreation. And, you know, what we've done is we've actually kind of created this brand that, you know, speaks to all of the different types of cyclists. There's so many different types of cyclists. And, you know, I think just being aggressively welcoming, and not saying you need to be a certain way and dress a certain way or anything like that. You know, people always ask like what kind of bike I have. I really don't care what kind of bike anybody has. You know, every bike is a good bike. And, you know, if you're, you know, getting out and, you know, just, I don't know, it's all good. So I think you can see how welcoming we are to people when you come to an event that we've had. You can see it in the people that are submitting, that are signing up to submit to our database. You know, when you come to an event, it's every type of person that shows up to these events. It's every type of bike. I mean, we get the crazy custom bikes all the way to the expensive race bikes, to the, you know, the grocery getters, to, you know, everything in between. And I think that that kind of speaks just to like that everybody's kind of welcome in the bike lane that isn't, you know, driving a car. So.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Tony, I'm curious. So it's interesting to hear you in your introduction talk about sort of that like inside outside strategy. And I am just curious if you could share, I guess, some of the examples of some of the like projects that you've worked on and how you've been able to engage and sort of build community support for parking reform. Because I know, you know, as a transportation person, and, you know, like I went to UCLA for planning school, like we have like a lot of pride in Donald Shoup, and, you know, like, but whenever I try to talk about parking, I feel like people, they don't always want to hear it, you know, because it's such a like, they're like, how dare you take away my parking? So I would love to hear a little bit more about how you have engaged with community members to build support.
Yeah, I mean, I find parking, you know, so fascinating. I don't understand. No, I definitely have met the same, you know, kind of glazed eyes and or just puzzled looks. I like to start out. I really feel like the first thing I usually try to go for is to just point out the cost and kind of the cost and the space it takes up, and really open that was what shocked me when I read Donald Troop's book, which I'm not a planner. I just kind of heard about it 10 years ago and picked it up. And I was just like, it struck me like, wow, like all of a sudden the veil fell, you know, and I saw like all this, like, you know, this parking space taking up space. And people usually don't recognize really how much it costs. And they don't think about like what could go in there. And also, I think really emphasizing to people the things like that it brings, that extra parking brings to your community, like the traffic. Like if someone there's an apartment being built and there's 100 apartments in it, and they say you should have parking. It's like, well, it's 7 a.m. There might be 100 cars then coming out onto the street. And does your kid go to school across the street from this apartment? Like where, you know, like what is the impact on your community from this, beyond the fact that maybe someone's going to park in front of your house that you don't know? And you know, there are, as you mentioned, there are ways you can turn that as a benefit too, through, you know, maybe repurposing revenue or, you know, subsidies. But I think that really highlighting, you know, the impacts that the parking brings and the cost, it at least softens people. They're not necessarily going to be gung-ho, you know, so-called chupistas maybe, but they're going to definitely, like, it's harder for a person who is, you know, I'd say, honest with themselves to write in an angry letter about parking once they recognize the impact it could have on the housing supply or the cost. I think another thing is that, you know, the reforms don't impact everybody in the same way. Many of the neighborhoods where lower income people live, for example, are often excessively overparked already. Like it's usually the area where the parking is congested is usually in the higher income or business districts, you know, like a lot of just the way that our cities have been built, you know, like the areas where a lot of people live on lower incomes maybe have a lot of street parking already, or just the development pattern is much more, you know, is spread out. And so it's not like a reform in a city is necessarily going to remove the parking supply in these neighborhoods, or is going to or you're going to put a permit district in the area where there's ample free parking. And so I think that just like kind of pointing out where you're looking at and what you're, you know, the ultimate impacts is been the most effective. I also, in particular, I think, you know, there was a time they were going to expand some parking requirements into Northwest Portland where there had never been them. This was around 2016, just as our housing crisis was really heating up. And I was able to make a very good connection to tenant activists and bring them on board, recognizing the cost of how it was going to impact the cost of housing. And that was very instrumental in, like, I think not only stopping that from happening, but kind of turning our tide in Portland, the narrative that we were headed on, which was kind of back towards more effective reforms. And so I think like the economic argument is a strong one for average people. I think, you know, non-transportation minded folks, I guess. Yeah.
Tony, I'd love to hear if you have any insights on how parking directly impacts the biking community.
In fact, that was when I first got involved in this, the first groups I reached out to were cycling groups. I was already a cyclist and I kind of had some connections in those groups. And so I made appointments with the heads of our cycling advocacy in Portland and kind of gave pitches to why it was important for cycling. And I think for cycling, the main, I think, things are the space, obviously, how we manage our curb space and how we value our curb space is, you know, if you want bike lanes, you usually are going to have to do something, remove some parking. If you want other, you know, or bus lanes or whatever the mobility, you know, changes you want. I think critical, like we know cycling networks work better when you have a lot of people who can live near where things are easy to ride to. So I think that the housing argument ties in nicely there of if you want to have a dense city where it's, you know, you have that density that you can have safety in numbers is important. And the safety factor, I think, is a big one too. The less, you know, like more parking is an invitation for more cars. Like I mentioned with that apartment example, if you build a parking space, especially a structured one, you are banking on someone parking there and driving to that space for 30 years. So, which on climate is already, you know, just blows my mind climate wise. But then even just thinking like street safety wise, like what what changes if you're want to implement a long-term bicycle plan. If you're building more parking in your neighborhoods, you're basically undermining that ability. Like if you want to close a street, right? If there's a parking garage exit onto a street, good luck in getting the city to ever turn that into an open street, because that you can't take away that building's access to that parking. You'd have to, you couldn't. So I think that's I think the main. And those are my main cycling arguments, I guess.
Thank you.
I was wondering for you, Christina, it seems like you have a pretty strong volunteer and a very active organization. And I'm just curious for tips on what how do you attract and engage and retain these people to help you with your organization?
To say that our following is active would be putting it mildly. We have extremely active, extremely passionate followers. And when I started Bike Lane Uprising was just this tiny little passion project thing that, I had kind of hidden on the internet. I was just kind of noodling around with it. I had, interviewed a couple of people about what their thoughts were, and then it just went viral. And it ended up on the local news. And, at no point in time did I realize it was going to be as big as it's become. And with that, I never anticipated that people would just want to volunteer and be a part of it, on the back end, doing like day-to-day kind of, tasks. And it was about a year into it when I actually formalized the way for people to get involved and, volunteer. And honestly, the passionate people found me. We have the most intelligent, the most passionate. I mean, they're just the leaders within their communities. I think what's great about the people that we've attracted is it's allowed us to not be seen. Well, yes, we do have a website. Yes, we have a mobile app. Yes, we're in kind of this technology space. People don't see us as the tech bros because there's so many people that are involved, and they come from all different walks of life that, we really reflect very diverse, stereotypes within the biking community. So, we're getting, the very niche demographics within biking. But we have people that are that work in city government that are volunteers, all the way to, just somebody that's moved to a city and they want to get involved with the biking community. It's a great way to meet friends. It's a great way to feel that you're not just complaining online, that you're actually, doing something. And, the reality is you could download any app on your phone, but how many of the apps are actually intended to, preserve the safety of your life? And that's, what we're doing is we're trying to make, getting from point A to point B a little bit safer for folks, and just kind of raise the awareness that, it's not okay to park in bike lanes. It really does impact, the safety of people. And, there's an economic, it's access to opportunity. Biking is one of the cheapest ways to get to and from somewhere. Oftentimes, cheaper homes are located further away from public, transportation. So there's a lot of socioeconomical, issues that, go along with blocking bike lanes. So, we work remotely. I know that there's some, questions about COVID-19 and everything like that. We were already working remotely prior to COVID, so it wasn't that big of a transition for us. And we also work remotely so that, folks from different states and time zones and, things like that can help out as well. And we've been incredibly fortunate to have extremely passionate and, wonderful people that have signed up to volunteer.
Thanks for that answer. I heard potentially there's a question out of this from the audience, but for maybe each of us to answer is how COVID-19 has changed the relevance and urgency of our work. I can just briefly say that one of the things I am hoping to see happen is a parking cash out program in Portland, or other ways right now as people are transitioning from in this transition time, you can capture changes in behavior. And I hope that we can, I think parking policy for my work is one way that you can lock in some of those changes. So I think that's critical now, but I'm curious what how the two of you feel about that.
About how COVID has impacted our work.
The relevance and urgency, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, for the disability community, COVID has been hugely impactful. I mean, there are tons of people in the disability community who still aren't leaving their homes because there are a lot of people who are extra vulnerable, who are immunocompromised. I mean, I personally was incredibly careful because I have a weak immune system. And so certainly just in terms of what the disability community has been through over the past year, it's been really intense. And I think in terms of transportation needs, that has also really changed. I mean, of course, there are people who needed to leave their homes for essential doctor's appointments who still needed to be able to get out and to get around. But were, people who maybe had been comfortable taking public transportation in non-COVID times didn't want to take public transportation because they were worried about safety. And I think now we know that public transportation, the spread of COVID is less of a risk. But of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't really know anything. And so people needed a way to get around. I think also just people in the disability community are in general. So I do think there was this a lot of people who maybe weren't using cars as much. I mean, certainly I have been driving a lot more during the pandemic because of those reasons. And, it differs for different people's disabilities. But certainly, people needed also to be able to get groceries or go to the store. And so all of the things that already have accessibility challenges for transportation were just compounded because of COVID. And so, one thing we did in San Francisco was start this essential trip card program where people were able to get funds towards taking trips they needed to take via paratransit or through taxi vouchers. And so that's one way that our accessible services team has reacted. Of course, there's also been in San Francisco, there are now a whole bunch of slow streets, which are streets that are mostly closed except for to local traffic. And then there's been a lot of conversation within the disability community about, the permanence, and of course, within everybody about the potential permanence of some of the slow streets. And I know people in the disability community, there's a lot of discussion there because there are these sort of, there are lots of folks with disabilities who were able to go out and enjoy the slow streets, but there were also lots of folks who, were staying home again. And so didn't experience that and are now sort of seeing these potentially large shifts in our streets on San Francisco. And so have a lot of questions about what that means for them. And so a lot of the response has just been around trying to engage with folks to understand what people's needs are, to sort of explain some of the things that have shifted, in San Francisco, right? And in most places, we weren't running as much transit service, which also, of course, impacts a lot of people. So I guess I feel like this answer is a little all over the place because the response is that really it has impacted pretty much all aspects of transportation for people with disabilities. And I think now our challenge as we look to the future is to think about the changes that happened during COVID that maybe we want to hold on to. And then also the changes that happened during COVID that we want to think more deeply about, that maybe happened very quickly and there wasn't as much of a chance for outreach or for input, or things had to happen because of budgetary necessity. And so making sure that the disability community is really part of these conversations about what the future of transportation looks like. And again, making sure that we can reimagine, when we're reimagining our streets, that we do that more accessibly and don't just treat accessibility and transportation as an afterthought or an add-on or something that we're only doing because of compliance, and instead of something that's core and integral because if we make transportation better for disabled folks, we make transportation better for everyone.
So from a bike lane uprising perspective on how COVID impacted what we were doing and, you know, just everything, I'm going to kind of merge this with a question from the audience. And the question from the audience is, how can we get beyond educating drivers on the need to not park in bike lanes to a point in which intuitive protected bike lanes are standard? From my perspective, it is as much an education problem as a poor infrastructure design problem, if not even more so. So big picture, during COVID and the lockdown, there was a biking boom. So I'm sure most people that are a part of, you know, this conference already know that. Most people, as they were just trying to avoid public transportation and, you know, exposure to the virus, they were, you know, seeking alternative modes for transportation. One of those was biking, but some people turned to driving more. So now we have this boom in driving and we have this boom in biking. What's good for biking is that we're a little less niche and we have more people that are invested in, you know, the fight for protected bike lanes, because, you know, some people saw what was potentially possible, or they're starting to see, you know, firsthand, like, oh yeah, you know, some of these lanes that, you know, I thought were, you know, so great, maybe aren't so great. You know, there's actually no universal design standard for bike lanes. So it's not just between cities, it's block by block and, you know, neighborhood by neighborhood, and, you know, just everything's so retrofitted, and there wasn't really a standard that's put in place. So if it's confusing for a cyclist where the bike lane is, where it ends, why did it shift from one side of the street to the other? Why did it just completely disappear altogether and pick up, you know, 3 blocks over? That's confusing for drivers too. So I think the more we can make design intuitive, you know, I come from a design background, so design is supposed to be intuitive. You shouldn't have to put so much mental energy in trying to understand. So, you know, can we move the trees out further so that people aren't driving through the bike lane because they couldn't see the gray curb on a gray street at night when the, you know, the bollards had already been mowed down, you know, things like that. But, you know, one of the great things that happened during the pandemic is we saw new demographics of people really just explode within the biking community. And one of the things, you know, last year, you know, it was a really demoralizing year for a lot of different people, not just biking people, but, you know, across the board. And you know, from a bike lane uprising perspective, we, you know, decided to use that time to really amp up a lot of organizations, biking groups, other people that were doing great things, because, you know what, it made us feel good. We enjoyed it. We liked what they were doing. We wanted to support them. We saw, you know, just these huge biking groups, you know, start, like, you know, just in Chicago alone, you had groups like Streets Calling that, you know, started in April of 2020. And within a month or two, we're getting, you know, up to like 500 Black cyclists out biking. And, you know, and that's a demographic of people that are just completely overlooked most of the time. So again, anything that we can do to really like keep people there, because so many people, they start biking and they start to see just how difficult it is, and, you know, how much of a struggle it is politically. It is not hard to build a bike lane physically. Engineering wise, it is not hard. It is not that expensive compared to all other transportation. It's political. It's all political. So if your city has the political will to build bike lanes, they will build the bike lanes. So that's my ending comment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciated that. And I also wanted to echo something that you said, because, you know, when you talk about the bike boom, I know for me, like so many of my friends who had, like many of my friends were already cyclists, but a lot of my friends bought bikes for the first time last year and were riding their bikes all over the place. And, you know, I would have loved to join them, but because my disability is a chronic illness, I have limited stamina. For me, riding a standard bike is not always accessible, but I can ride an e-bike sometimes, and I really love that. But because I have that limited stamina, I have limited confidence in my ability to get out of the way of a car quickly if I need to, especially because I do have so many cyclist friends who've had so many close calls, and in some cases have had crashes. Like, I know I would have loved to, instead of, you know, switching from taking most of my trips by transit to taking most of my trips by car, I would have loved to take many of those trips by bike, but because we don't have the infrastructure, around where I live, where I feel really safe, for me, like the bar is higher than it is for some other people, because I know that because of my disabilities, I would be a more vulnerable cyclist. And so I do think, there is this whole swath of people who would cycle and who would love to use that as more a more frequent mode of transportation. But yeah, when we don't build infrastructure that's safe for everybody and comfortable for everybody, then we're leaving a lot of people out.
We should be seeing all people driving and people in cars as potential cyclists, because when somebody is in a car and they're going by bike lanes that are completely unsafe, completely blocked, but you don't see people biking in them, that's why, because everyone sees just how dangerous it is, like yourself. And a lot of people within the biking community, you'll see like, oh, is e-biking okay? Or, the e-scooters and, all of that. It's like, more power, yes, have everybody welcome into the bike lane, yes. Even people without a disability still get tired and still enjoy using an e-bike. So it's one of those, adaptive, forms of transportation that, it's there when you need it. It's, you can maybe not use it if you don't want to use it, but it's there when you need to go maybe a little bit farther, a little bit faster. It's a little too windy. So.
Yeah. And I think another point that I sometimes make to people in the disability community is that the more people who are currently driving who then switch to cycling, the better things will be for disabled folks who really do not have a choice but to drive, who need to drive, right? Like if you are so sick of getting stuck in traffic, if we can get many of those people who don't need to be driving in cars into the bike lane, and I mean, same for, this is, I think you mentioned this earlier, like bike lanes also help get people off of the sidewalk who might be riding on the sidewalk, which is safer for disabled pedestrians. But I do think like when we just approach those conversations with that bit of nuance where we say like, yes, like, I know you said everyone can ride a bike. I don't like 100, I think not everyone, but I think a lot of people can ride a bike. And I think certainly far more people could ride and would ride if there were better options available than currently exists. And I do think like it would benefit the people who do need to, like a car is also a different kind of mobility device for some people, and it is essential for some people. But that's not the case for the vast majority of people who are driving. And so if we can get them in the bike lane, things are better for everyone.
Interestingly enough, we have pedestrians that submit to our database because they understand that the bike lane is blocked. And that's why people end up on sidewalks.
There you go.
Maddie, I like to sometimes point out that if you can drive a car, you can probably ride an e-trike, right? I mean, like there are non-car devices that if you can drive a car, you probably, also can do that. And to really kind of highlight that there are so many people who can't, I think the people who we need to be most concerned about are people who can't drive for some reason. Like those are the people who have the least mobility in our society. And that it's always kind of topsy-turvy when we're, placing people who can drive, either be low income or disabled people above the needs of the people who can't drive, who are in those same categories. And I think, that's something to really, try and highlight.
Yeah, I know Nate wants us to wrap up, but I want to say that's an excellent point. And I do think the voices of people who can't drive either because of disability or don't have access to a car because of income or other reasons are the most vulnerable people, and their voices do get lost.
Well, thank you everyone for a really lively and insightful discussion. I really appreciate all of your thoughts, and I'm sure I'm speak for everyone at SUMC and all of our attendees that there was something to learn from each of you in this session.